A Jewish family with 3 children were our closest neighbors in Amsterdam. Since Doris had been a regular visitor at their house, I felt they should know that she was gone. When I told Mrs. Saffer of our decision to give up Doris, her reaction was quite upsetting. "What kind of mother are you?" she screamed in outrage, "to separate yourself from your child?" For months, those words haunted Siegfried and me. Had we really done wrong? Nobody could then know that the entire Saffer family would perish during the war, in accordance with the German plan. It was impossible to know what to do. Was it better for a Jewish family to separate and hope to find each other again at the end of the war? Or should they stay together? Was it better to be quiet and passive toward the Nazis? Or should the Jews resist and fight their oppressors? The Jews in Poland's capital city of Warsaw chose resistance. Ever since the Nazis overran Poland in 1939, the city's 500,000 Jews had been crowded into a ghetto, about 1 mile long by 1.5 miles wide. There were 27,000 apartments in the ghetto, each with an average of 2 to 3 rooms. That meant every apartment was home to approximately 15 people, 6 or 7 per room. Living conditions in the ghetto were worse than terrible. Starvation, filth, and disease lurked everywhere. Those who did not die there were deported to death camps, and their space taken by new arrivals. One survivor described the ghetto in a notebook that he buried in the basement of his apartment. The streets resound with the futile screams of children dying of hunger. They whine, beg, sing, lament, and tremble in the cold, without underwear, without clothes, without shoes, covered only by rags and bags that are tied by strings to their meager skeletons. Children swollen from hunger, deformed, semi-conscious, children who are perfectly adult, somber, and tired of living at age 5. Every day and every night, hundreds of children literally die on the pavement, and there is no prospect of ending this tragedy. This was the scene in the Warsaw Ghetto on April 13, 1943, when the Jews decided to revolt. By now, the population had shrunk to 60,000, for the Nazis were preparing to shut down the ghetto. Most of those who remained were young people determined to fight their captors. When the order was given to ship the remaining Jews to death camps, the ghetto exploded in gunfire and resistance. From the beginning, it was a suicidal move, but most of the young people preferred to fight than to go passively to their deaths. Even though their homemade weapons were no match for German tanks, artillery, and machine guns, the Jews held out for nearly a month, fighting from windows, rooftops, and cellars. Finally, on May 8th, the SS dealt the final blow by attacking the group's leaders, its 100 toughest fighters. Those who were not killed committed suicide. By May 16th, the German officer leading the attack was able to announce, "Warsaw's Jewish district is no more." Resistance like this was not common, however. While many Jews have wanted to fight for their lives, few felt they had much chance of succeeding. They lacked the organization to stage well-planned uprisings, and they had few means to gather guns or ammunition. But there were other ways to resist. One was to go into hiding. Of the 140,000 Jews living in Holland, where the Germans invaded, 20,000 chose this route. Righteous Gentiles and members of the underground helped them find places to hide. It was clear now to Helen and Siegfried that they too must go into hiding if they hoped to survive. A few weeks after we said goodbye to Doris, Jovis announced that he had found a hiding place for us in Zaandam, an industrial town just outside of Amsterdam. Sadly, we left our apartment, which had meant so much to us, and all our furniture, and went by train to our destination. In removing our yellow stars and carrying false identification, we were committing serious crimes. We were to stay with a young couple who lived on the first floor of their home with two small children. The grandmother lived alone on the second floor. We would take our meals with her and spend our days in her living room, but sleep in the attic. After a few weeks at this house, however, our hosts began to have second thoughts about hiding us. They were worried about taking such a risk and finally asked us to leave. We had the same experience many times in early 1943. People were understandably nervous and frightened, so the only solution was to find another hiding place. On one occasion, we were asked to leave the same day we moved in. It was extremely dangerous for a family to hide Jews or any other enemy of the Reich. Those who did risked the same punishment as the people they were hiding, death or imprisonment in a concentration camp. In the spring of 1943, Jovis and his wife Agathe took into their home a young man who was on the Germans' enemy list. 2 days later, the Nazis arrived, searched Jo's home, arrested everyone there, and sent them to prison. Jo was shipped to Dachau, one of the most horrible of the concentration camps. In the days immediately following the capture of someone in the underground, other workers went into hiding. The Nazis questioned and even tortured those they caught in an effort to gain information about the movement. The arrest of Jo's household did little to stop the underground workers. Others simply carried on his tasks. Stepping in to take Jo's place was Reinus Hille, an educated, informed man who had long been active in helping the Jews. Soon, the underground was called upon to find a new hiding place for Helen and Siegfried. They were to stay in Zaandam, they were told, with a young couple and their small children. The Tiertes' house was small, barely big enough for Piet and Geer with the two babies. They had no spare room or no extra bed, but they gave us their mattress since our bedding was still at our first station. We could not risk moving our belongings through the streets. The warm-hearted Tiertes slept on their bed springs while we slept outside their bedroom on the floor, sharing a space with sacks of potatoes and onions. We stayed with them more than 3 months, embarrassed by the inconvenience we knew we were causing. At last, a larger hiding place was found for us in the beautiful old city of Haarlem. Our hostess, known as Mevrouw, Little Woman, slept on the first floor. She rented the second to a seamstress, Greet Driesen, and her elderly mother. The attic had 2 bedrooms, one for Mevrouw's 3 teenage daughters, and a smaller one for us. Our home had a window to the street, but we were never allowed to open it. Mevrouw cooked all our meals, which we ate upstairs, because anybody might walk in at any time. This place was our home for 1 year. Living in hiding was nerve-wracking, but it was also boring and tedious. Unable to go outside, there was little that people could do to pass the time. Rinus brought books on his bi-weekly visits, which Siegfried spent most of each day reading. From his research, he formed ideas of what the world would become like after Germany's defeat. In tiny penciled handwriting composed in his newly learned Dutch language, he filled 17 school notebooks. In them, he wrote of a world changed for the better by the war. These changes would start to happen, Siegfried predicted, when people awakened to the horrors that anti-Semitism and prejudice had brought upon Europe. Helen and Siegfried had no contact with Doris. Abe Rusnick visited her regularly and left some money with her keepers. Piece by piece, Abe had sold the Wolfarth family jewelry to provide money for their upkeep. Reinus, too, visited Doris and assured Helen and Siegfried that she was adjusting well to her new family. Best of all, he brought them pictures that showed she was happy and content. People in hiding had to rely on the underground workers for all their outside needs. It was simply too risky for a Jew to be seen on the streets. Just how risky was made painfully clear to Helen and Siegfried when Reinus arrived for one of his visits. He brought heartbreaking news of their friends Euro and Gerda. Euro and his wife and mother had been sending letters, toys, and gifts to their little girl Vera, who was living with a family in a nearby town. After many weeks, they discussed the idea of bringing Vera for a visit to their hiding place. Since Gerda had a blonde Aryan look, they thought she could travel undetected to pick up Vera. Unfortunately, their longing for their little girl overshadowed good judgment. Gerda and Vera were arrested at the train station on their return to Amsterdam. Euro and his mother waited in their attic room for many, many hours before learning the news. Gerda and Vera were shipped to Sobibor, an extermination camp in Poland, and were never heard from again. Jews were now being deported to death camps in record numbers. October 16, 1943. 1,000 Jews are arrested in Rome after a house-to-house search. They are deported directly to Auschwitz. Only 16 survive. October 19. A train of 1,007 Jews leaves Amsterdam bound for Auschwitz. October 21. The Minsk ghetto of Soviet Union, home to 2,000 Jews, is liquidated. All prisoners sent to their deaths. The killing continued with persistence and precision. Trains carrying deportees ran exactly on time. The SS made certain of that. In fact, some military leaders complained that Hitler's obsession with killing the Jews was hindering their efforts on the battlefield. Men, machinery, and supplies used in the deportations were often given priority over military needs. German generals had reason to worry. Their military machine was failing. The Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe were now showing grave signs of weakness. Even the once feared U-boats, German submarines that destroyed thousands of tons of Allied ships early in the war, no longer posed much of a threat in the Atlantic Ocean. Taking advantage of the growing cracks in the Reich, the big three Allied leaders, American President Franklin D. Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, met in late 1943 to plan a major new attack. Operation Overlord was the code name for the Allied plan to retake France from the Nazis. D-Day, on which Operation Overlord would begin, was set for June 6, 1944. On that day, thousands of Allied troops would move by boat into the English Channel. From there, under the command of American General Dwight D. Eisenhower, they would storm the beaches of Normandy in northern France and go ashore to liberate the country from the Nazis. The D-Day landings caught German forces completely off guard. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, in charge of troops in northern France, was visiting his family in Germany when he got the news. What the Field Marshal would later call the longest day was half over by the time he first heard about it. Rommel was powerless to stop the surge of 176,000 Allied troops who stormed ashore in Normandy. There was no doubt about it. The D-Day landing was the greatest land-sea operation in military history, a decided victory for the Allies. At their hiding place in Haarlem, Rinus brought word of the D-Day invasion to Helen and Siegfried. It came as wonderful news. Hearing of the Allies' success, we were certain that the victorious armies would soon cross into Belgium and Holland, and we would be free. Unfortunately, events didn't happen that fast. On Friday, August 25, 1944, the Allies reached the French capital of Paris and freed it from the Nazis. While thousands of people could then breathe easier, we could not. The same morning, 4 men in plain clothes arrived at our hiding place. 2 were German Gestapo officers, and 2 were Dutch police who worked for the Gestapo. They announced that they had the order to arrest us. These men looked through our few belongings and suggested that we take some warm clothing, because where we were going, the weather would be cold. Searching further, they found a picture of Doris. If this is your child, or if you have more children in hiding, they said, we advise you to take them along. You will be going to a family camp, and while you are working, the children will be cared for. We did not believe a word these men said. Later we learned that head money was paid for every Jew. The more Jews the guards delivered, the more they were paid. We did not respond when they asked about our child, nor did we take any clothing. Wherever we might be headed, we were already hoping for a chance to escape. Should that moment come, anything extra we carried with us would be unnecessary weight. On the way downstairs to the car, I kissed Gray goodbye and pressed in her hand a pin in the shape of a coral branch. It had been a gift from my mother-in-law, given to her by her husband. Strangely, Muerzi and the girls were nowhere to be seen. Every country in Nazi-occupied Europe had a Durchgangslager, where Jews were collected for deportation. These were transit camps, not labor or concentration camps. Most prisoners stayed in them only a short time before they were deported. Camp Westerbork in Amsterdam was a transit camp for Jews arrested in Holland. Every Tuesday, a new train loaded with at least 1,000 Jews would leave Westerbork for the east. Sometimes there were several trains a week. During the course of the war, more than 120,000 Jewish prisoners passed through Westerbork on their way to their fates in other camps. Late on in the evening of August 27, in the darkness of wartime blackout, a streetcar brought all of us from the prison where we had been held to the train station. From there, a train took us to Westerbork. The spirit in this camp was surprisingly high and hopeful, and we met some friends with whom we had lost touch. We stayed at Westerbork nearly a week. In the early morning hours of September 3rd, our names were called over the barrack loudspeaker to report again to the train station. There stood a train of completely empty cattle cars, which seemed unbelievably long. Soon every car was jammed with young children, babies, old men, and women, and obviously sick people. About 160 per car. There was no seating and no room to sit on the floor. We had to stand body against body. Since there was no air and there were no openings in the doors, it was dark and uncomfortable. Only a small bucket was available for toilet purposes. It soon became impossible to find any room to squeeze to this bucket. Restless people called out for the guards, but no one ever answered. On the way to the train, everybody had gotten some bread, and after this was eaten, the calls for water began. Again, without success. It is hard to describe this situation, but much harder to have lived through it and adjusted to the growing stench. During the trip, the train seemed to stop many times. On 3 occasions, the doors opened and a few soldiers came in, but not to bring water or offer help. The first time, they collected fountain pens. The second time, watches. And the third, money. They told us that Dutch money was worthless at our destination, and it must be handed over to them. Siegfried and I, still wearing our money belts, gave the officials only what Siegfried had in his pockets. After dark, we took off our belts, tore all our money into little pieces, and threw it on the filthy floor. How hard it was, both physically and mentally, to destroy this money for which we had worked and saved for years. It was Siegfried's idea, for which I am forever grateful. At no time were we told where we were going. At one point on our trip, Siegfried said to me, "I don't know where this journey will take us, but I don't think that I am capable of living through whatever it is. On the other hand, I am sure you will return to normal life and to our child." In his way, Siegfried was giving up hope before his time. During the next 9 months, I would see a similar loss of hope among many of my companions.